Okay, we're going to start here talking about Nixon's foreign policy. As soon as I move this into the right spot here. There we go. Okay. So that's what I'm looking for. All right, so here we're going to talk about Nixon's foreign policy here, and we're looking to figure out the extent to which Nixon's foreign policy resulted in an easing of Cold War tensions. So remember, the Cold War is this tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it's gone through periods after World War II where sometimes the tensions were higher, like, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then other times when tension was lower, the period of détente in the early 1960s. So when Nixon becomes president in 1968, Nixon had kind of a reputation as a foreign policy expert. And so he thought this was a strength. But of course, he's coming into office while the Vietnam War is still going on. So his foreign policy has to be satisfy two things. One, it has to attempt to deal with the tensions with the Soviet Union, but also he's got this really unpopular war at home that he has to try and manage as well. So one of the things he does in his foreign policy is this attempt to preserve kind of America's credibility as a world leader. So the Vietnam War is not going particularly well. The United States is trying to find a way out of it without admitting losing, right? Because if you admit losing, then that's a weakness, and that's a win for the Soviet Union in the Cold War because the North Vietnamese were communist. So Richard Nixon has this idea, what he calls Vietnamization, which is essentially training the South Vietnamese soldiers to kind of take over the war. And then as the soldiers get better, American military will withdraw, leaving the South Vietnamese to fight the war themselves. However, this is not particularly effective, and it does not actually do a whole lot in terms of being able to end the war, as well as being able to make the United States more successful in Vietnam. Okay, but you do start to see a reduction in the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam. So Nixon then kind of pivots to this idea of a peace with honor. It becomes clear that the United States is not going to be able to win this war, not to anybody's satisfaction. And so the idea that Nixon wants peace, wants to end the war, but with honor, a way to preserve kind of America's dignity. And so you have this meeting between Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, and the North Vietnamese, and they meet in Paris. And they basically have trying to make an agreement to come to a ceasefire. And it doesn't, they have the basic agreements in place, but the United States ends up, has been bombing in December of 1972. They are bombing North Vietnamese targets, and it kind of like Nixon's trying to use that to force the North Vietnamese to make concessions in the Paris Peace Conference, but it doesn't totally work. Okay, Nixon ends this Christmas bombing, and they have sort of an agreement for a ceasefire. However, in 1975, so we have about a 2-year period there where this idea of the ceasefire is occurring, but then we start to have the North Vietnamese. They have this kind of offensive, full-scale kind of offensive, military offensive, and they end up North Vietnamese end up capturing Saigon. And so Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam, is turned over to North Vietnamese hands. And this is kind of seen as a humiliating defeat. American soldiers have to leave. They're kind of caught by surprise. They have to leave very suddenly. And there's this, famous video of American helicopters leaving the American embassy, the last people out of Vietnam. And then Vietnam ends up getting reunified between the communist North and the non-communist South, and Vietnam becomes a communist nation. So this is kind of a loss in the Cold War. So in terms of easing tensions, it doesn't really ease tensions. It's kind of seen as like a loss for the United States. In the meantime, Nixon saw an opportunity to try and make ease tensions a different way, which is attempting to use other nations to limit Soviet power, particularly China. So Nixon visits China, and this is important because Nixon was such a strong anti-communist back when he was a congressman, vice president, that sort of thing. And so he visiting communist China was a big deal. This is kind of a first, right? And this kind of opened up the relationship between the United States and China. And today China is one of our largest trading partners. They're still communist, and we still have definitely issues with China. But this kind of opened up that a bridge between the two nations. And so this was kind of a success for Nixon here. China gets allowed into the United Nations, and they're kind of part of the international community. And because of this, because we have this better relationship with China, Nixon believed that this forces the Soviet Union to kind of come to the table to negotiate about nuclear weapons. So we have these strategic arms limitation talks, SALT I. This froze nuclear weapons at their current level at that time. So in the arms race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, SALT I is an attempt to limit nuclear weapons here, and this is a result of the U.S. and China having a better relationship. It forces the Soviet Union to come to the table because they don't want to have the United States and China form any kind of friendship. Nixon also introduces what's called the Nixon Doctrine here, which is essentially a way to avoid another Vietnam. It's saying that the United States is going to develop its friends and allies around the world, but they're not going to get involved in these smaller local disputes, like in Vietnam, which is essentially a war for independence among the Vietnamese, a civil war among the Vietnamese. So Nixon wants to kind of keep the U.S. out of these smaller disputes, and this actually holds true for a long, long time. All right, our final category here is the emergence of the volatility in the Middle East, right? So it's not really about the Cold War, because one of the things about foreign policy is presidents can't really control what happens outside their borders, right? And so what happens is we have tension really ratcheting up between Israel and the rest of the Middle East. We have the 6-Day War, where Israel kind of gains control of Jerusalem, and it creates this Palestinian refugee crisis. The Palestinians are people that live in Israel but are not Jewish, and Israel was created after World War II as a Jewish homeland, and so there's dispute over who has access to Jerusalem. It's a dispute that's still occurring today. You also have the Yom Kippur War, where Israel was attacked by Egypt. Israel fought back and was able to make significant gains, but the U.S. kind of pressured Israel to back off and create this kind of ceasefire. So it's not so much connected to the Cold War as it is to kind of oil, right? Because the Middle East has a lot of oil reserves, and what happens is in the early 1970s we have an Arab oil embargo. That means Arab countries stopped trading oil with the United States, and what that caused are a rise in gasoline prices. There were gas lines, fuel shortages. It was a real problem for many Americans, and Americans are dependent on their cars, and so they were paying a lot more for gas. And so this really illustrated how much power these oil-producing countries could have over the United States just by turning off the spigot of gasoline production or oil production. Okay, so Nixon's foreign policy eased Cold War tensions in one way with the freeze on nuclear weapons, and got the United States out of Vietnam. But he was also kind of had to react to other situations which were out of his control.